My name is Ian Huzzy. I am a researcher with the Parkland Institute. I'd like to welcome you to day 2 of the conference and respectfully acknowledge we are gathering on Treaty 6 territory. This morning we have Sam Moore here to speak about ecofascism and/or democracy. Sam Moore is an anti-fascist researcher and writer. He is one half of the collective 12 Rules of What, which produces a podcast on the politics of the far right, and he has written 2 books to date. The first one, published by Dog Section Press, is called Post-Internet Far Right. His most recent book, The Rise of Ecofascism, Climate Change and the Far Right, is published by Politicity. His present work, separate from the collective, is focused on a critique of collapseology. Maybe you can explain what that is, as it appears both on the far right and across the political spectrum. So please welcome Sam Moore.
Thank you, Ian. Collapseology is a kind of collection of ways in which people understand how societies fall apart. I'm going to talk mostly about a concept called ecofascism. I wrote a book about with my co-author Alex Roberts. It's a concept you've almost certainly heard of, and I'm basically going to try and say 5 things. So I'm going to say, first of all, what it is, like what is the concept, what does it normally describe? It's been much talked about in the press. It's been much worried about amongst groups of environmentalists who are anxious that they themselves might be secretly or accidentally eco-fascists. And it's used as a kind of an accusation against various different kinds of people. And it's often taken to mean something, one of kind of 3 different things, which I'm going to suggest we can think about a bit more clearly. One of which is a spate of right-wing terrorist attacks in which some appeal is made to nature. The other is as a collection of what you might think of as conspirituality ideas, the kind of the nebulous collection of ideas in which spirituality and conspiracy thinking are merged. And the third one is the kind of things that far-right governments do when they finally decide to take climate change seriously. So one of those 3 things, or possibly 2 of those 3 things, or so on. And I'm going to basically suggest it's the wrong concept. Doesn't really help us. It's not clarifying. There's a line from Stuart Hall, the cultural theorist, about Thatcherism in the UK, when he says that the left's attempts to fit Thatcherism inside the idea of fascism actually ends up obscuring almost everything that it's actually important to keep in mind about fascism. And I want to suggest something similar is kind of happening with the idea of ecofascism. The reason for that is that the concept of ecofascism misses how the far right is actually organized. It misses that most of the far right is not fascist, and that its ideas of nature are more complicated, fractious, mediated, and indeed contradictory than we normally understand them to be. So I'm going to talk about far right nature politics, which is the idea of ways in which ideas of nature become contestable objects in politics. So then what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about the history of something else, or something quite similar, which is far-right ecologism. I'm going to look through that history and look at the ways in which the far right has presented nature politics at different times, different places, different relationships to extraction, to the organization of nature, and so on. There's obviously a tendency, which people are probably aware of, in at least kind of journalistic writing about the far right a few years ago, particularly in American journalism, to present the far right essentially 3 things: the KKK, Hitler, Trump. Like, this is not a good history of the far right. Like, we can do much better. So I'm going to try and think about like the way in which we could fill that concept out. I kind of suggested that fascism is not the organizing principle of the contemporary far right very, very often. And so I'm going to think about a concept instead. I'll try and get to a concept of fascism that allows us to clarify what it is. And then you're kind of wondering perhaps why it is that the book on the left is called The Rise of Ecofascism if I'm saying that actually fascism is not a particularly important part of the far right. Well, 2 reasons. The first reason is that we thought it was important when we were writing the book to take seriously the kinds of anxieties that were produced by the events on 15th of March 2019, when a gunman went into Christchurch, New Zealand, 2 mosques, and killed 51 Muslims, and called himself an eco-fascist and justified himself. When someone tells you they're a fascist, take them seriously. And the second, and then the kind of the final part of my talk, is going to be a question of how ecofascism, as a concept, as an idea, as an organizing principle for the far right, might start to matter again in the future, and how it is that we can think about how it might become to matter. So we're going to talk about the crisis we've just had. I'd like to take you back in your memories to the end of 2019, which in the UK was a moment of bitter disappointment for the left. I'm thinking of December 2019 in particular. Jeremy Corbyn was decisively defeated by Boris Johnson. And the way he did that was by constructing the idea that it was, particularly in the north of England, in a collection of seats that are called the Red Wall, constructing the idea that it was Brexit and not Thatcherism that was the central determining feature of politics. These seats have never voted Conservative. They haven't voted Conservative for a very long time, particularly older members of the community, avowedly would never have voted Conservative because of what Thatcherism and successive Conservative governments did to the north of England. And so what I want to suggest is that Boris Johnson took advantage of a kind of a way in which one crisis replaces another in politics. It's what I call the kind of the last big hill theory. The idea is you're driving forwards through history, let's say, and in the rearview mirror, instead of Benjamin's pile of wreckage, we have a collection of hills, right? And perhaps not around here, where you have either mountains or plains, seemingly, but in the UK, the way the landscape is arranged is that you can only see the last kind of big hill, even though the structuring conditions for getting to that hill is perhaps an enormous mountain range behind, although that part's not in the UK. And so what Johnson was able to do was kind of replace the crisis of Thatcherism, the deep structure of Thatcherism in politics, with the structure of Brexit. And so what I want to come back to repeatedly is this idea that we can essentially take one crisis and we just kind of place another crisis on top of it, and then we forget the previous crisis. And I want to kind of look at how that happens in what I'm calling far-right ecologism, far-right nature politics. So that's 2019, late 2019, a moment of bitter disappointment. And then cast your minds forward from there to May 2020, mere 5-6 months later. We are in a totally transformed world. Right? The crisis of COVID has happened. In Canada, I think you have the wage subsidy scheme, or wage subsidy program. In Britain, we had furlough, lockdown, and so on. So the scope of political action, the scale of political action, the collection of things that are possible in politics has totally transformed. This might structure the way we think about climate change. We've often kind of been asked to think about climate change through Hollywood movies and so on as one of a few things. Either it's a collection of polar bears kind of floating on bits of ice out into the Arctic, or it's a collection of like slightly hotter hot days, or it's like an event so apocalyptic that like skyscrapers are like falling into the sea and everyone dies. And what I want to suggest is that the pandemic, with this collection of events, mass death events, sudden stresses on global supply chains, previously unthinkable changes to everyday life, massive discrepancies across class and racial groups, a generally increased anxiety, racially displaced blame, the tightening of surveillance regimes, the mainstreaming of conspiracy culture, sudden return to governments acting exclusively and aggressively in their national and class interests, and so on. This collection of things, now we have an intuitive sense of what that is like, be much more applicable as a kind of a way of thinking about how climate change will present itself to us as a crisis. As I mentioned before, we had, in the center of politics, or kind of across the mainstream of politics, we had furlough, a completely unthinkable idea. The government just kind of pay people's wages. And then, of course, of great relevance to the far right, we had a very short period, under a year, between the beginning of the pandemic to a group of people, mostly influenced by probably the most powerful and important conspiracy theory of the contemporary period, QAnon, who attempted to invade, let's say, the Capitol building and prevent the ratification of an election. So these are huge transformative moments. But what I want to suggest is that ecofascism, when we think about ecofascism, doesn't actually capture the scale of far-right nature politics that was present or operative in the pandemic. But they did develop a nature politics. We should think about what that is, like what it is to contest or understand ideas of nature in politics. So, of course, I don't want to give a kind of slightly false impression of where we are now. Since 2021, the beginning of it, lots of things have happened. Lots of things that were not QAnon, that are not to do with the pandemic have happened. Jair Bolsonaro was, of course, defeated by Lula. It'd be very interesting to see how the political economy of Brazil, how the difference in commodity trading markets from when he was first in power to now changes what he can conceivably do. Trump, of course, seemingly was kind of a detriment to the midterm elections, and now he's announced his run. One of the more interesting theories, I think, about the midterms is that possibly that the reason why people didn't vote is because if you tell them their vote doesn't matter, they will not vote. So I'm not entirely convinced there's like an absent kind of constituency here. What else has happened? Oh yeah, Marine Le Pen was defeated in an all too close election by Macron in France. Of course, France is two-stage presidential election doing what it's supposed to do, which is to prevent both the left and the right from coming to power. Giorgia Meloni is now Prime Minister of Italy, almost 100 years to the day of the March on Rome. Bongbong Marcos replaced Rodrigo Duterte as the president of the Philippines, replacing essentially a vicious far-right politics of retribution with a much more complicated but equally vicious politics of nostalgia for the previous Marcos regime. Narendra Modi did very well in the 2020 elections earlier this year, despite a huge excess death toll from the pandemic. This is Suella Braverman. People don't know who this is. She's the Home Secretary. In the UK, we've had a deepening turn towards a kind of vicious anti-migrant politics. Again, seemingly there is no kind of bottom to this process, although of course it would be somewhat silly to describe it as fascism. So it's a very mixed picture. So we're no longer in the heat of the pandemic, I don't think. We're not in that kind of like the most extreme moment of it. And that gives us time to take stock, to think about the future. The way we do that is, I think, by looking at the past of what I'm calling far-right ecologism. So that future is likely to be just as like ridden with crises as the last 2 years have been. It's not going to slow down, not going to turn off. But whereas the pandemic is a very particular kind of threat, we're going to see many more different things in climate change. Extreme weather events, possible crop failures, food shortages and so on, different parts of the world, and so on. The kind of the uneven texture of catastrophe and mundanity that structured the pandemic as a particular kind of crisis, as well as its like intimate quality, seems now retrospectively to have been the perfect foil, the perfect soil in which QAnon could plant its seeds. But I'm going to suggest that, of course, not all crises are like that. And I want to think about the way in which there's a kind of an ongoing crisis as well, a kind of a degradation of living standards that is not present in this spectacular cinematic form of the pandemic, but is more brutal and more anguishing. So each crisis we encounter will be encountered differently. The management, mediation, and so on of crises will be multifaceted, complicated, contradictory, as it always is. In the unpredictable consequences of this pattern of crisis, that the threat of the far right lies. But not entirely unpredictably. We're not just kind of like facing a kind of chaotic future. Instead, it will draw on ideas from the history of what I've called far-right ecologism. So I'm going to give you a definition of this. Far-right ecologism is not ecofascism. Instead, it's supposed to be the name, the concept, the idea that unites all the ways in which, I will read it, people produce or reproduce racial hierarchies in and through natural systems. This is immensely capacious kind of concept in some ways, but also I think allows us to grasp the contradictions of what we're actually looking at. And then even longer definition of the far right, which really emphasizes its farness, its relative position to the liberal center of politics, because we, I think, still live in basically liberal politics. That concept picks out those forms of political behavior which work on or advocate for the reproduction of capitalist social roles and relations on the basis of ethnic nationalism, racism, xenophobia, anti-Semitism, often through the application of violent means at odds with principles of formal equality, and thus, at least publicly, unavailable to the liberal state. I think this is a useful definition because it connects us to the reproduction of like the overall totality of society, while at the same time thinking about what is exceptional about the far right. And so we get both the idea that it's interlinked and the idea that it's quite kind of unusual in the grand scheme of things. This is the kind of the triptych I want to kind of present to you. This concept of far-right ecologism allows us to look at the different categories, the different variegated nature politics, its diverse and indeed opposed political forms, and its seemingly permanent production anew by the sheer diversity of crises that produced by capitalism. Of course, environmental crises or crises of nature are as old as people doing things with nature, which is as old as people. But nevertheless, the kinds of crises that we see in capitalism are distinct in some ways. They're distinctly classed, they're often distinctly raced, gendered, and so on. And deciding what constitutes a crisis is always socially contested, and the experience of it is, again, differentiated by class, race, gender, and as well as a huge number of other forms of social distinction. For some people, a crisis might appear as an environmental crisis with governance implications, or as an ecological crisis, which cascades into a crisis of ideas, or for a few, as a kind of symbolic crisis, whose solutions require the reimposition of a naturalized order. And it's those that I'm focusing on when I describe far-right ecologism. So some responses to crisis have utilized components of what we broadly describe as far-right politics. So asserting strict racial hierarchies of, care for, access to, power over, positions within nature. And these stratifications serve an economic role as well as a symbolic one, forcing the re-evaluating of parts of nature, including people and groups of people. And all too often, this means an aggressive cheapening, or the driving down of the price of something, such as the denigration of enslaved people's rights to labor, life, and freedom, the mass killing of indigenous peoples, and the systematic devaluation of women's labor. So these responses all both form a natural order and also defend property ownership. And so they're reflected not only kind of practically, but also in thinking. We have not only a collection of kind of material political forms, but also a collection of techniques and ideas for managing this tension. And it's this fundamental tension that I want to get to, which I think ecofascism obscures. And that tension is the tension between, or that exists across the far right, between affirming the social relations and mode of production of capitalism, and affirming that those things will carry on, while at the same time trying to downplay, deny, remediate, reorganize, displace all the consequences of that mode of production and all the ways in which that mode of production produces crises, right? There's a life world that the far right wants to preserve, but at the same time it wants the social roles and relations that continuously threaten that life world to carry on. And so it wants to affirm the disease and deny the symptoms, right? Sort of this kind of tension. So in the middle of the slide, we've got a kind of collection of political forms. We've got racialized mass movements, deadly violence, and authoritarian states. And this is a way in which you can kind of categorize three broad responses of the far right to the crises. What I'm going to go into later when I'm talking about why I don't think we have fascism, is I'm going to simply describe like why it is that these three things don't really fit together right now. They did, and they couldn't have get. So this is the kind of quandary we're in. I'm going to talk through three kind of different moments in the history of this process, starting with what's called the environmental critique of colonialism. So from the beginning, rapid colonial expansion entailed widespread ecological destruction. Having done so, it faced an environmental critique not only from without, but from within as well. So because of the transformation of environments, colonialism entailed rapid experimentation with conservationism. Richard Grove, whose excellent histories of this period people should look at, describes this as being a kind of exclusively interested in the economic aspects at the very beginning, because climate change, or like environmental change, represents a really major threat to the possibility of continuing extraction. Particularly things like desiccation of soils mean that you can no longer plant the things that you want to plant, and you might trigger a famine, and you're half around the world, and and so on. So it kind of entails a certain kind of crisis. But it wasn't just a kind of practical thing. The colonists' economic concerns were supplemented by more kind of metaphysical anxieties, while islands were often cast as Edenic. Other landscapes were thought chaotic and hazardous, and so environmental controls were often imposed in order to kind of bring them back profitably, crucially profitably, towards kind of normalcy. So the Comte de Buffon, the 18th century naturalist, proposed that climate change could even bring about the denigration of crops and man alike. So the sense in which nature is this kind of bounty, but also it's this thing that if it changes, represents a kind of threat, a kind of possibility of denigration. So there were kind of these grander apocalyptic visions behind even the most practical concerns. And in some ways, it's kind of the tension between these practical concerns and the apocalyptic visions that I want to be focusing on here. Similar ideas, although not identical ideas, were also used in order to justify things we would describe as green grabbing now, stealing people's lands in order to propose that you can better care for them. In British colonized India, Algeria, colonized by the French, these ideas were used particularly about forest management, the idea that forests exclusively or uniquely capable of being managed by the white settlers and not by the indigenous people. They emphasized the racial exclusivity of effective environmental governance, and at the same time asserted that indigenous peoples of these places had not been adequately or properly using the land in a sufficiently industrial way. And these two ideas go together. So on the one hand, indigenous peoples are not industrious enough. Other ways, they're too industrious. And so we have this kind of this permanent tension between these two things, which structures, I think, the far right nature politics of this moment. But this process of conservation was not conserving in kind of a pre-social nature, but only a nature that was already, in some sense, reorganized by the arrival of both norms and also different species into particularly North America. So in the 1870s, this process becomes like much more intensely deliberate. The US Army, of course, deliberately target the bison, who are slaughtered in order to deliberately starve the indigenous Americans as a practice of genocide, right? And then once dominion, in that sense, had been secured, the colonists worked to fix in place a particular ecology, destroying in that instance the tall natural grasses of the plains and planting short grass instead for cattle, which locked in a particular form of land use, but also a particular set of social relations. The arrival of the colonists, here as elsewhere, involved an ecological rift, followed by an imposed stasis in nature use. And this is only the second most polemic thing I'm going to say. Polemically, nature use in the colonies, even conservationist nature use, was a kind of enforced peace after a triumphant war. Something very different happens in the fascist period. There's a lot in between these two things, but I unfortunately don't have time, so you've got to don't take my word for it. Something very different happens in Fascist Italy. So there are huge projects of reclamation and transformation are launched, including dredging 75,000 hectares of these death-inducing swamps. This is the Pontine marshes, just north of Rome. The marshes were declared sterile, and therefore they had to be rendered productive. Fuel and food self-sufficiency were the immediate aim, but the project was also presented in the Italian press, where it was widely publicized, as representing a kind of production of an ideal landscape in which the ideal fascist man, the ideal fascist woman could thrive. And militarism here is deeply embedded in these projects. The names of these little villages that were kind of set up, the kind of camps across the marshes, were mostly employed veterans from the First World War, and also were named after the battles those First World War veterans had fought in. Right, so the continuation of the militarism of the First World War, which fascism, of course, affirmed, in the form of a domination now not of the enemies, but of nature. The same thing happens in Italy's colonialism around the time, in invasion of Abyssinia. It presented this as a kind of benign colonialism, bringing back into normalcy this kind of wild first nature of Africa that needed to be kind of reimposed. So as Federico Caprotti and Maria Caica summarize, for Italian fascism, whilst nature, as the ultimate nurturer of the ideal fascist citizen, provided inspiration for the regime's social project, nature as wilderness proposed a frontier that had to be conquested and colonized and so on. So it's kind of production of and subduing of frontiers. In Nazi Germany, some Nazis advocated nature protection, but it was one in a set of very contradictory ideas. There's a profound tension between, on the one hand, the drive to war, and on the other hand, the attempt to preserve or conserve nature. Probably no regime so bent on militarism and rearmament could have been green in any conventional sense. I want to focus on one particular aspect of this, which is the Reich food estate, headed by Richard Walter Dare. The purpose was to harmonize the tensions in food production, but it was caught in these kind of complex economic contradictions. To make perhaps perhaps what is obvious point obvious, there is a profound tension between people who want cheap food and farmers who want to be paid a lot for the food, right? Like, you can't just assert that these things are not in tension. You can't just and this herein lies, of course, one of the central contradictions of fascism as a project. But Dare was a kind of a disregarded as a dreamer. His project failed, as perhaps we would say it obviously would do. And it's often been claimed that Dare's ideas were kind of betrayed. This is the kind of the death of the really substantial kind of peasant-oriented Nazi projects, but I think that's actually not true. So on the contrary, I will claim, Dare's ideology, in which Germany needed to expand into Eastern Europe to meet its food needs. So the kind of things that Dare insisted upon doing, small-scale farm production, in order to affirm the kind of the peasant way of life, or how he saw the peasant way of life. Peasant is, of course, quite a bad translation of the German word. It just means like farmer, but like in a particular German way. In order to affirm this particular kind of social system that he saw as the kind of the root of like the true Germanic nation, he rejected the kinds of efficiencies that had been made possible by things like the Haber-Bosch process and the fertilization techniques that were developed. And in order to do that, meant that he just needed more land. And of course, the central contradiction there is that the land to the east, particularly the land in Ukraine, the kind of famous black soil, extremely fertile, already have people on. And so the eliminationist programs we see in Eastern Europe, of course, the Holocaust, first and foremost, are sort of justifiable or understandable inside the Nazi system of thought as a necessary consequence of trying to produce a particular kind of social system around food. Not completely, of course, but nevertheless, there's something there, I think. So I want to kind of give a definition now of fascism. So this comes from Michael Mann, his definition. I'm going to make explicit things that are just kind of implicit within it. Fascism is a political form that seeks to revolutionize and reharmonize the nation state through expelling a radically separate other by paramilitary means. This definition relies on the coordination of these three parts: an authoritarian state, the capacity for deadly violence to be wielded, and a racialized mass movement. Because fascism seeks to legitimize itself through a self-declared intimate connection with a homogeneous people, it requires a dense mass associational society, a thick society. If people remember a debate that was had 4 years ago thereabouts between Dylan Riley and some other people in the New Left Review, there was an argument basically that the reason why Trump couldn't be a fascist is because he didn't have this kind of mass society, this kind of thick society behind him. I think that's basically true, but I'm going to make some caveats. Because its notion of the homogeneous people is totalizing, it seeks to recruit all of life, both in the sense of a private life and in the sense of a natural world, into its project. And thus fascism develops a kind of a highly normative and voluminous nature politics. This vast nature politics, I want to suggest, is a consequence of the prior encroachment of capitalism into life, also in the sense of private life and natural world. And so fascism becomes intensely interested in the interface between humans and the natural world. But because it's a capitalism is mystified and racialized, it does not consistently oppose capitalism's incursion into the control of life, biopolitics, but ascribes different aspects to this incursion, different racial characters. Right? This kind of control of life is properly German. This kind of control of life is like Jewish. This kind of control of life is, and so on. It kind of has like this, it kind of filters out these forms of control. Drawing from nature the bleak lesson of scarcity, competition, and dominance, it affirms the natural character of racial struggle and the superiority of its own race within it. So I want to move on to more recent forms of what I'm calling far-right ecologism, which turns around the kind of tension between securitization and denialism. Denialism, the story is well known. It's a well-known story. The far-right denies climate change. That's the story. There's a bit more to it than that, but there's also kind of a collection of interests with oil companies and other fossil fuel companies as well, but that's basically the main picture. And it falls outside what we might describe as ecofascism, right? The point of using the term ecofascism is often to describe a turn away from this kind of strict denialism. But I think it's comprehensible as a project or as a strategy within what I'm describing as far-right ecologism when paired with securitization. So accepting the difficulty of the relationship between social problems and environmental crisis, securitization responds in a way I've been kind of outlining has happened before by treating the effects of environmental destruction as first and foremost a kind of security problem, whilst also suppressing attempts to deal with underlying cause. I want to give kind of one vignette of this. Perhaps you'll remember when George Bush is presented with the catastrophe of Hurricane Katrina, he goes on TV and invites the American public to think about it not as a natural disaster or an environmental disaster, but as if it had been a nuclear bomb. Not a hurricane, but actually just like, this is a further excuse for further militarization of the environment. There are many, many more examples of this that we can talk about at different points. So more recently, the Trump and Bolsonaro governments in particular have been widely criticized for their inaction on or even acceleration of environmental problems. So they haven't been preparing or haven't been engaging with climate change. And I want to suggest that's basically not quite what's going on. Far-right governments, such as those two, who reject the need for or the possibility of the mitigation of climate change, nevertheless consistently pursue adaptation. That is the capacity of reorganizing society to deal with the impacts, but not at the level of, if you're going to face a pandemic, building hospitals and so on, but at the level of securitization. So Trump denied climate change and yet proposed building the US-Mexico border wall, which, according to the US military's own forecasts about this, would be useful to stall further climate migration. Bolsonaro enhanced the paramilitary powers of the police and installed military officers. Giorgia Meloni has blocked in the last kind of week or so these boats from coming across the Mediterranean. India has built the world's largest, world's largest border wall with Bangladesh, huge razor wire border wall, in order to protect, it seemingly thinks, from climate migration from Bangladesh into India. And so in all cases, like I've been suggesting happens across the far-right ecologism, the disease is denied, climate change is denied, and the symptoms addressed, but only at the level at which they appear for the far-right coalition itself. And so the question is, if we have these three components, the racialist mass movements, the authoritarian states, and the deadly violence, do we have ecofascism now? So the fascist coordination now, these three parts, I think have come apart. But I'm going to suggest ways in which they could come back together. So the current far-right is actually not one movement, but is massively internally fractured, both around ideas, but also around tactics. You could split it up according to different geographies, of course. You could say there's kind of a European far right, there's an American far right, there's different systems around the world. But I think this is probably the most useful way of doing it. Thinking about political tactics. So mass association, as I've suggested before, because it allows the movement to present itself as like the true spirit of the nation, is essential for and fundamental to fascism. But we don't have a mass society anymore, big claim. Instead, we have our racialized movements that are not mass movements. They're kind of fractured, they're kind of sporadic. Society's been, to some extent, dissolved. This is the point of, Wendy Brown has a really good book, Undoing the Demos, another book, In the Ruins of Neoliberalism, where she discusses the ways in which the neoliberal project was an attempt to kind of dissolve societies, get rid of the connections between people, such that fascism in some sense couldn't happen again. And she traces the kind of tragedy of this position as it kind of reconstitutes a different kind of far right. The taboo on political violence, or deadly violence, which has been inconsistently applied across since the Second World War, really, I think remains somewhat strong, kind of waning. Interested to know what you think about that. And states just like, it wouldn't be quite proper to describe states in the West as authoritarian states. I don't think that's kind of slightly silly. Eco-fascist, when we use the term, names a group of people who at present are members of a coalition that really can't come together, that is trying to come together, but like can't come together. Like it doesn't work in the current political context. Just giving one kind of particular example, there was a group called The Base, which was a kind of paramilitary far-right group, active in Canada, active in the US, in Sweden, partially in the UK as well. And they explicitly thought of themselves as the kind of the paramilitary avant-garde of a mass movement. And their frustration was that they were the paramilitary avant-garde to a movement that didn't exist. They're like, we can't find this mass movement. We've got the deadly violence. We're willing to shoot people, but we haven't got this. And the state, of course, they conceive of as their enemy. There's lots of interesting stuff about the way in which the far-right concept of the state has shifted, but maybe we can talk about that a bit later. So why am I arguing for this particular concept? Sally Haslanger, I don't know if people come across her work, has developed an approach to concepts that orients us towards their capacity to achieve liberation or some other political goal. So we design concepts because they allow us to orient towards our capacity for achieving liberation. We have a kind of responsibility towards producing the right kind of concepts that allow for this to happen. And for me, the kind of proper like anti-fascist concept of fascism is the one that allows you to break it apart from within, allows it to kind of like be dissolved in these kind of ways. So are we really done with mass association? Like, do we really not live in a mass society? And this is the kind of the conundrum of QAnon in some ways. Because it reforms, to give you one statistic, I think it was 56% of Republicans in 2020, kind of late September 2020, when polled, said they thought that the QAnon conspiracy was like all or partly true. So really a genuinely mass like collection of ideas. And it's mobilizing, obviously. It really does make people kind of mobilize. But it's not the complete thing. There's still a kind of a sense in which there is a tension between the authoritarian state and deadly violence, partially because the authoritarian state is the desired object of QAnon's fantasy. So QAnon believes itself, if people don't know what the conspiracy is, QAnon is a belief that Donald Trump is fighting the deep state, which consists of a collection of elite Democrat pedophiles. That's the conspiracy. In 2020, what happened is that it became kind of crystallized, a kind of complete vision of the world, a kind of a whole cosmology, no longer just kind of focused on this particular thing, but developed a kind of an enormously voluminous kind of nature politics. Although it's kind of mass movement, it's also kind of inchoate, complicated, fractious, it falls apart. There are what's called different factions of QAnon, like different aesthetic types and so on. It's not quite a mass movement in the way we might kind of expect mass movements to have been before. And it's bound together by what I call conspiratorial entrepreneurs, kind of mom and pop shop outlets for conspiratorial ideas. You can find someone who produces the right kind of conspiracy for you. It's like Shopify or Etsy or something, but for like conspiracies. I don't want to claim that QAnon is just some sort of like peculiar remediation of climate change. It's not just sort of a secret way of thinking about climate change, even though it has ideas of absolute good and evil, which you could definitely understand as a kind of a remediation of a sort of environmental discourse about climate change, and an apocalyptic horizon, increasingly. I think instead it's possible to think about it in terms of a broader ecologism, not just environmentalism, an ongoing catastrophe of environmental toxicity that expresses itself as forever chemicals in the water, microplastics, hormonal disruptors, low-quality food, and so on, the ongoing small disaster of ecological life, a kind of a decimation that is then taken up on the far right. Of course, again, the thing that happens, the kind of the social relations that structure this, business, kind of broadly conceived, the rights of property rights and so on, the social relations that I think cause these kind of crises, these kind of disasters, the lack of environmental regulation, for example, is affirmed, while, as I've suggested again, before, the actual consequence of these social relations is denied. And so we have, again, this kind of tension between the disease and the symptoms. So where are we going? Just as there have been before, future variants of far-right ecologism, I think, will resolve around this failure to solve the central contradiction. However, the question will change, right? The question will increasingly be not just about kind of politics in the abstract, but about fossil fuels. So I'm going to suggest basically two kinds of ways in which we could see a far-right movement orient itself around the question of fossil fuels in the era of climate change. Deeply remediated through a kind of conspiratorial cosmology that I expect to only continue. Like, I don't expect people to come back down to earth and kind of face soberly the question of parts per million of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, right? This doesn't fit inside the kind of the worldview that I'm just talking about. But nevertheless, I think in some way we'll see a kind of remediation of the question of fossil fuels as the generator, to some extent, of the crisis we're facing in climate change. The first plausible future is what we call batteries, bombs, and borders. And it sticks together climate change mitigation with a kind of a new Cold War rhetoric. Militarization abroad and intensifying control of populations at home and at the borders. So we can think of it as a kind of an eco-governance turn within conventional imperial power. The second one, what I describe as fossilized reaction, is protective of fossil capital and willing to take denial and concealment and obfuscation pretty much as far as possible. So it's an extension of the kind of current logic of securitization and denialism. Possibly with this kind of coalition that I've been describing, the fascist coordination, stuck back together. I think we're returning to a kind of mass politics, right? We've been returning for the last 10 years. We're getting much closer to it. And so we're likely to see ever more intense contestation of the meaning of crisis. Crises are mass experiences of sense-making. This is the point of the exercise that I had you do at the beginning where you thought about 2019 and 2020. QAnon and movements like it reorganize the sense of the political possible in a moment of crisis by diverting the scope of political action further and further towards a kind of an action on the astral plane, a kind of a permanent apocalyptic horizon. But this is not the necessary tendency of far-right politics. It doesn't have to escape into this kind of dream world. Much of far-right ecologism in the future will be eminently practical, although, as I've kind of suggested, it will fail to resolve this contradiction that I've been kind of delineating. And we should therefore be kind of on the lookout for future movements. This is the most polemic thing I'm going to say. With the rise of mass associational societies, the possibility, or return rather, of mass associational societies, the possibility of making a clean separation between movements that are properly democratic and movements that are not properly democratic, far-right movements, will become increasingly difficult. It'll become more and more tricky to say that there is an absolute difference between the far right and democracy, or indeed between fascism and democracy. High levels of civic participation are devoutly to be wished, because that is where democracy really lies. But high levels of civic participation are not the opposite of fascism, but one of its enabling conditions. That's it. Thank you.
Wow, that was a lot, covering so many things. Colonialism, fossil capitalism, the role of the state, political participation, deadly violence. Many topics woven together, I think masterfully. There's a lot in Sam's speech about the application to Alberta, our current government, our economy based on fossil capitalism, the role of social movements. Just let me know if you have a thought to offer or a question, a comment.
Hi, Sam. My name's Chris Subb. Thanks so much for that. So in the Alberta context, this tension that you're describing, I think we would really aptly see in sort of our right-leaning, coal-rolling, big diesel truck driving, but I hunt and I fish and I want the splendor of nature to be here at my disposal for those personal activities, and sort of in that tension you described. Have you seen anything, or in the ways that you think about how might this tension ever be resolved as the likely tip in terms of which way these folks will go? Ultimately, will they choose their truck, or will they choose the trees in the duck pond? And how do you kind of frame that in your mind?
Maybe I can talk to the kind of the global scale of the problem rather than the kind of the local context I don't really know much about. The two futures are compatible. We could see particular states go in the kind of fossilized reaction way and double down on this kind of securitization of climate change, while at the same time a kind of global system of what's called eco-apartheid kind of emerges. I think that's a totally plausible thing. So I think both is like the most plausible answer at the global scale. Locally, the impacts of climate change are very different depending on where you are, and depending on what kind of social entitlements you're able to enact. I don't know very much about how climate change might affect the local environment here. But certainly, there are lots of different kind of ways of adapting, I think, to most of the kind of climate change we're going to see, say, in the American context or in France or the UK. And so I think probably the preservation of the life world will carry on more or less indefinitely, but it will take the form increasingly of an escalation towards violence, an escalation towards control of that. The way in which contradiction is experienced on the far right is not as a kind of a thing that makes anything fall apart, right? Far right movements don't fall apart because they're contradictory, they escalate because they're contradictory. And so I think that's probably a kind of a likely future. Although, not an expert in that particular kind of instance, but yeah, great question.
I really appreciate your talking about the escalation towards violence, but when you said that the future are compatible, I thought that really resonated with me. As someone who lives in rural Alberta, where the diesel trucks are chosen, but also who hunt on our land and I create food, I pondered that too. I'm often the one who's the foolish one in the community by being so concerned the way I am concerned about the people part of our world. But we're not going to become compatible if we keep pointing the finger at that other group that has the diesel truck or at the group that's doing this. That's the problem. The truth is, all of us here have another form of diesel truck in our lives. And I think to be compatible means we have to be honest about where we are, as opposed to pointing the finger and feeding the violence of where you think someone else should be different. As a farmer, we're working very hard to keep our environment sound because my livelihood's on it. The land is everything. And yet I suffer the consequences of being on land that's been broke 100 years ago, still in our family, but we've been stewards of honest, good care for 120 years of that land. We are compatible, but we both sides have huge things to look at and self-reflect so that we can be compatible.
I really agree. I mean, I think that one of the main tasks for a kind of politics of liberation over the next 50 years, right, let's say, kind of strategizing quite broadly now, to really seriously think through what a kind of a politics of complicity, of culpability would be like that wouldn't generate the kinds of reactionary backlashes, right, that we see on the right.
When you talk about the role of labor unions, or look historically, which in and of itself can be a form of power, winning power, what lessons might you have, and in particular, in feminized professions? Because you talked about a misogyny at the very beginning and the marginalization of women. So I'd be interested in the role of labor unions.
I think unions are really good and very important. I welcome the participation of unions in mass society. The capacity of unions to articulate a stable, coherent worldview. We can counterpose QAnon, its kind of inchoate kind of chaoticness, to the French Union movement without more or less any breaks apart from the Second World War when it became a resistance movement. It's been a very consistent kind of just stable sense-making institution. The same is true in Germany as well. There are these big systems of organizations, in fact, on the left of kind of mass society that allow for the kinds of crisis that we experience to be mediated, to be understood, to be considered in ways that don't generate the peculiarities, the kind of the bizarre worlds of QAnon, right? That being said, the multifacetedness of crises under climate change will almost certainly lead to a situation where the kinds of politics that unions have traditionally affirmed, either inapplicable or actually contradictory to the things that need to kind of immediately happen. I imagine this is the case, particularly in Alberta. I don't know much about Alberta, as I suggested before, but I imagine this is the case perhaps around unionization of fossil fuel industries, particularly with regards to kind of feminized occupations. Definitely, overwhelmingly, those are quite low carbon kind of occupations. And so I'd imagine that the kind of multifacetedness of that kind of organizing, which it takes both from the feminist tradition and from the union tradition, will probably be more flexible, more capable of dealing with the kind of multifacetedness of crises as they present themselves, and less obviously contradictory with the imperative to reduce the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere.
I'm just responding to some of the other pieces here rather than just maybe to get your sense of it. When we're talking a bit about those contradictions within the far-right construction or of its relationship to the environment, thinking about here in Alberta, there was a massive campaign by our provincial government to privatize strip mining in the Rocky Mountain Range in one of these most tourist attractive, recreational, much photographed sort of parts of our province. And this, of course, sparked a counter movement, which then became kind of co-opted in a certain way by the opposition party as well, to say, here's the government that wants to strip mine the mountains, here's the opposition and lefties and progressives and hippies and crunchy people and, right, all the woke people want to save nature. And how... Right, and Corblund singing country music, right? So we're bringing all of these things together. But there was that contradiction about how you frame that as Albertanness within a sense of provincial identity, which increasingly here in this province is being used as sort of a proxy for national identity, a type of Albertan nationalism. I think what was interesting about that is we have a movement that wants to sell our province on the basis of its environmental beauty, on the basis of its resources being there. Our environment minister for many years was a notorious poacher. This is at the heart of it. And what I'm wondering about, I guess, is saying how then these pieces that you're talking about, extraction and profiteering, basically using up every last drop, while also preserving a certain element. For example, you can pay for a pass to visit the unspoiled part of these mountains now, if you have the means, right? And so that there's a class element to that, but also an increasingly sort of like identity piece. If you're a real Albertan, you don't mind us wrecking the mountains while also paying to enjoy them. How do all of those pieces fit together, or is that they just don't and we pretend they do?
They don't, and I don't think we should pretend they do, but definitely people on the far right do pretend they do. That's a really great example of the kind of tension, the kind of contradiction. Is it both sides of that contradiction that are affirmed as like Albertanness? I think that's a really great example of exactly the kind of the tension that I'm also asked a kind of similar question about, like, which way will they choose? Maybe it's kind of a question for like the room in general, but like, how do you think those tensions will be resolved? Like, I'm kind of curious how people think that will go if it becomes more acute. If they think it becomes more acute, why?
My name is Emma. I'm a climate organizer. I work for a global climate justice organization. And one thing that kind of gets talked a lot, I think, about in the climate movement, but probably not enough, is this degree to which climate change in a lot of ways is the first sort of mass existential crisis that I think white people have really had to contend with. You know, Indigenous people and people of color, it's not the first. There's been many times, you know, you talked a lot about colonialism, but I'm wondering the sort of relationship that you see, well, first of all, whether or not you would agree with that, and then how you think that sort of impacts this far-right ecologism that you're talking about. And then finally, when you're talking about the sort of mass politics and that it becomes harder and harder to sort of distinguish between the far-right and democracy, the more that the mass politics sort of grows. I think something that comes to mind is the more that we're building these sort of mass movements, what's oftentimes happening is that it's a mass on-ramp, I think, for a lot of white folks that are experiencing this sort of existential crisis. And then when moments like Black Lives Matter erupts, and there's a degree to which that sort of desire to politicize people through that movement, there's a lot of resistance to it. And what happens is this is a distraction. We can't talk about white supremacy. We can't talk about racism. We can only talk about climate change. That's more a comment and a thought, but would love to hear your thought on that.
I think I basically agree. Maybe there's one moment before this of existential peril experienced en masse by white people, just the invention of the atomic bomb, the possibility of nuclear annihilation during the Cold War. There's some really fascinating work by someone whose name I've forgotten, who wrote a book whose name I've forgotten, about the way in which geography of cities, particularly American cities, changes, about how white flight from the urban cores functions as a kind of a attempt to get away from the possibility of being at the center of the nuclear blast. That kind of existential peril, I think, is experienced, but then it's quite like rapidly remediated or rapidly kind of reorganized. The on-ramp is incredibly important. What I described earlier as kind of a conspiratorial entrepreneurialism by QAnon is basically a kind of a huge on-ramp to a kind of a far-right worldview. And the reason why I think it's so effective is because it manages to draw on the kinds of shattered neoliberal life world that people already exist in, right? So you will see the same tropes in QAnon as in like Marvel films. Whatever it is that you experience in your day-to-day life, in your kind of cultural consumption, QAnon has a way of getting that aesthetic into the overall conspiracy. And so there is this kind of sense of, as mass politics comes into play, it has to start by like picking up the things kind of from where they are. I'm wondering where that is in the climate movement, like what it is, how we pick up the kind of the material of everyday life. And this is, of course, in contradiction with what I was saying earlier about the need for a kind of a nuanced and like complicated politics of complicity, of culpability. On the question of apocalypse and the kind of facing apocalypse, I mentioned at the very beginning, or that Ian mentioned, that my current thing is about collapseology. And part of the kind of the critical theory of collapseology I'm trying to generate or think about is exactly around this question. It's like the end of the world is a thing that's already happened repeatedly. It's like a huge number of different people because to some extent the world that we live in now destroyed those worlds, right? That is the material basis for this world, is that other worlds were obliterated. I kind of suggested in the final slide, the fossilized reaction or the batteries, bombs and borders, that instead of the environmental movement, we are very likely to see many different environmental movements emerging as it becomes like the central object, in the same way as we see different positions on all manner of questions like emerge as they become the central question of society. I think that almost certainly those are the same, very broadly construed. I think almost certainly white supremacy and climate change are the same story. And that's what we're trying to get at with the kind of the discussion of a colonial nature management, a kind of a construction of like a whole world that is organized around simultaneously the destruction of and preservation of aspects of nature. I think that telling that kind of history might be a way of resolving this kind of tension that you're seeing in the environmental movement. But I would suspect there will be further fracturing, further mass politics developed with contradictory different parts, different bits.
We've come to a 15-minute break. At 10:30, we have 2 panel sessions. The first is called Myths as Reality, Alberta Politics, Society, and Democracy at a Crossroads. And the second one is called The Rural-Urban Divide and its Impacts on Politics in Alberta. Thank you very much.